Hello, friends, and welcome to the January 11th edition of Weekly Witness. It's been a little while since we've been here, but welcome to Texas Impact's weekly opportunity for mainstream Texans of faith to learn about public policy issues here in the great state of Texas and have a conversation about how you can engage in the process. My name is Scott Atnip, your host and Texas Impact's Outreach Director, and today's episode is being brought to you by Methodist Healthcare Ministries of South Texas. And today we are going to be previewing the 87th Texas Legislature, which will convene tomorrow. We'll be joined by a couple of Texas Impact board members, but before we bring them into the conversation, a couple of quick programming notes. First, we recognize that there was a horrific insurrection in Washington, D.C. last week. We know there are a lot of people who are living in anxiety about that. We recognize that we're living in a country that needs to have a national conversation about systemic racism. And we know based on your emails and text messages that that is something you all want to talk about. We also know that there are a lot of places where you can get content about that. And so we're going to keep our podcast focused for the next 20 weeks on the Texas Legislature, recognizing that many of those issues that are taking place at the national level will shape our thinking over the course of these 20 weeks. But again, the Texas Legislature does convene tomorrow, and so that is going to be the weekly witness focus for the next 20 weeks. We are going to be recording live every Monday at noon. If you'd like to join us for the conversation live, you can go to texasimpact.org, click on the weekly witness link, and register to receive the link to join us by Zoom webinar, or you can just watch it on Facebook Live. Monday afternoons, that content will also be available in the podcast feed, and so we hope that you will share that with your friends and networks. It's going to look a little bit different during the legislative session. So each weekly witness episode after today will feature a weekly word from a Texas faith leader, presentation from a policy advocate on an issue of the week, which you can find in our weekly e-news or on the website. And then Josh Houston will join us for our legislative update of the week and our action alert for the week. So make sure you sign up, subscribe, and receive the content during the legislative session. Also, tomorrow being the opening day of the Texas Legislature, you will remember that in the past, going back decades, Texas Impact has hosted an interfaith service of public witness to welcome the Texas Legislature to town and pray for the work that they'll be doing. This year, because of COVID-19, we're not going to be gathering in person, but tomorrow morning, Tuesday morning at 10, we will be releasing a video version of the Interfaith Service of Public Witness at 10 a.m. on all of Texas Impact's channels. So we hope that you'll watch, share, tweet at your legislators, and host a watch party or Zoom viewing party for your friends and congregations. Y'all, I am really looking forward to the work that we're going to do together this legislative session. We've been saying it for a year and a half, and now is the time. It is time to get to work. For those who are joining us live, we hope that you enjoy the conversation. Please feel free to use the chat or ask questions of the panel using the Q&A feature at the bottom, and we'll try to get to some as if we have time at the end of the broadcast. So with that, I am excited to welcome to the conversation today 3 of our Texas Impact board members who just got off of a pretty long board meeting. So I appreciate you all hanging around for some extra conversation. We have with us Annaliese Cothron from San Antonio. Annaliese, thank you so much for being with us today. We have with us Reverend Phil Dieke from the Dallas area. Phil, thanks so much for joining in. And finally, last but not least, also from the Dallas area, we have Mohamed Elibiary. Mohamed, thank you so much for the time today. So Annaliese, we'll start with you. We've got first round of questions here, and we do have, our target audience is people of faith throughout Texas. And so it's important for us to ground ourselves on why we do this work. And I would argue that now more than ever, it's vitally important that Texans of faith engage in the public sphere. So, Annaliese, what from your faith tradition or background inspires you to participate in the policy process, and why is it particularly important now?
Well, hi, Scott. Thanks for asking the question. I'll start by saying that I'm a Unitarian Universalist. So we consider ourselves really to be humanists. And one of the key concepts and one of our 7 principles as a Unitarian Universalist is the interconnected web of life. So we believe that we are all connected, and that is our social responsibility to support each other in service and in love. And so, as a piece of that, policy obviously is so interconnected, and public policy um, is inherent to that web of life. So that's where I start. That's sort of where and why I'm driven to do what I do. And I would also add to that within Unitarian Universalism, we have a very strong sense of justice. I think these concepts probably prevail in most of our faith traditions. This is certainly not limited to Unitarian Universalism, but those are the two key values that really drive my passion for public policy and wanting to see social justice, particularly for vulnerable communities, for marginalized and oppressed peoples, is really pursuing justice on their behalf, and being able to do that with Texas Impact, and being able to express my faith tradition at the same time is really important and critical right now with all the division that we are facing.
All right, Phil, same question.
Yeah, so I'm a United Methodist clergy, and we have what we call the social principles in United Methodist Church, which don't get talked about enough for sure. But in the social principles, one of the basic things is just the basic freedom and human rights of every person. And by every person, I mean every person, right? There's the idea that all people are created in the image of God. And we truly believe that was an important and founding aspect of who it is for us as a denomination and for us as a church. And so I really push for that and the advocacy for all human beings. And then that also plays on what our founder, John Wesley, talked a lot about, was that, we focus a lot on personal piety, and that's an important thing, but we also really focus on social holiness. And if we do one without the other, then Wesley believed that we're not doing any of it. You can't do one without the other. It's two sides of the same coin. And so, at the local church level, we pushed a lot for personal piety, but now as a church, we're also really pushing for what it means to be involved in the social community, and how do we make a difference within our congregation, but also within our community, within our state, and at the federal and world level too. So I think that's a big part of what it is. And why is it more important now? I think that we push really hard to be nonpartisan, or at least we recognize that everything we do is political, both as a church and as beings in general. Everything we do is political, but it doesn't have to be partisan. And so I saw a lot of energy for the last couple of years focused kind of around like Trump gave us something to focus around, a kind of a rally against, almost, is what I saw a lot in different mainstream circles. But what I'm really focusing on now is, what are we rallying for? What is it that we as a people can really unite around? And so we'll talk a little bit more about that here in a little bit. But I've seen a couple different places where there's almost an anxiety coming about because we don't have this this being or this person to be focused against. And so there's this almost concern of, can we really rally people to be active and to get out and really advocate for a bunch of different policy issues when we don't have somebody to be against and opposed to. So that's why I think right now is a really important time.
All right, Mohamed, thoughts?
So I'm a Sunni Muslim, but for all practical purposes in the public square here in Texas, I've just functioned as a Muslim, a big tent Muslim. And I'll get into the theological divisions amongst, I guess, people from outside our faith, outside of Islam, tend to look at us as kind of a little more monolithic than we really are. We're just a few centuries younger than Christianity, so we might have a little smaller denomination number, but we're getting there. Diversity of opinions and everything else. I guess my experience basically has been, sometimes politics does cause an awakening in your personal life. So for me, it was kind of like after 9/11, I was like, so what exactly does my faith tell me to do in the public square? Prior to that, I was kind of just living my own life and not necessarily thinking about the bigger society around me and the concept of community. And you can approach, I guess, your value system and your religion a little bit more narrowly, or you can think of community as big and broad, literally everybody living in Texas. And I was kind of raised to think big when it comes to defining community. So the faith values that frankly drive me are the same Abrahamic faith values that you find Texas Jews and Texas Christians have always espoused. We didn't really invent anything, coming from the same region. So I think that the element of the now part, I kind of see like the last 5 years as forcing a lot of us as Texans and Americans to question what exactly do we believe in, and how should we be dealing with the almost seismic demographic, economic, whatever socioeconomic changes are going on in the country. Texas is not immune from that. When I was young, maybe I'd hear from folks and run into people who would talk about the Republic of Texas kind of idea of us seceding or being our own thing. But I think that kind of selfishness, so to speak, has kind of gone away. And all of us as Texans now, we kind of see ourselves as the way the country's going, we're going to go along. So we might as well try to think of where do we want our country to go. I agree with Phil wholeheartedly that the last 5 years, it's been easier to mobilize people because the culture shock, so to speak, of what we were seeing on the national level really struck people who aren't usually active. But it's harder to go from being against something to being for something. There's an in-between phase where we kind of have to talk and think about, well, what is our values and how do we translate it into public policy? And in my experience since 2003, when I attended my first Texas Legislative session, Texas Impact had done a lot of work over 3 decades prior to that of convening faith leaders across the state to think deeply about those issues. And so I'm thankful for Texas Impact continuing now, 20 years later almost, to help us and our state moving forward.
So one of the things that Bea talks about when she does her Advocacy 101 presentations is that we don't advocate against things. We advocate for a better version of Texas, or a better version of our community. And a couple of y'all have addressed that. There is a lot of energy right now about what we don't like, right? But I think we can all agree, across any spectrum that exists, that things could be better, right? And so I wonder, as the Texas Legislature convenes tomorrow, what's one thing you hope Texans of Faith will prioritize? What's something that we can advocate for to make Texas a better place during this session? And we'll start again with you, Annaliese.
So I think at the root of what I would challenge us as a faith community to root for is equity. And I think that really has to be the value and the lens from which we look at all of these other policies. Personally, I think racial equity is necessary. It has to be a part of the conversation. And we as white people have to recognize where our personal obligations have been in perpetuating systemic inequity. And this is in Texas, and it's everywhere. But the process of equity has to be a piece of the conversation, because The result of inequity is all of the disparity that we see in our health system, in our education system, in our justice system. So when we talk about systems change, that's at the heart of what we're getting to, is saying that these big systems have to change in order to make people's lives better. And policy is one of those solutions of creating systems change. And so we have opportunities now in this legislative session to work towards systems change. And personally, being in health, I think we have to address all of the inequity that we've seen and experienced here in Texas that COVID-19 has only amplified. We have so much inequity related to our health system because we don't have an adequate public health infrastructure. We have the highest number of people prior to the pandemic. We had the highest number of people and the highest proportion of our population without any type of health insurance coverage. And so that has only been amplified with COVID-19 and the loss of jobs, obviously chronic health issues now becoming acute health issues. And so we have to start with where our system is placed, which is a foundation of inequity on many levels, including racial inequity. There's a lot of inequity by location, particularly here in a geographically diverse state like Texas. Rural versus urban is a huge issue, again, amplified through COVID-19 and the lack of rural healthcare infrastructure and the rural Texans that are suffering right now because there isn't infrastructure in place to help them. It's our responsibility to ensure that we're passing policies that help rural Texans so that they can experience equity. And then I think just here in Texas and on a broader level, one thing that we need to be mindful of is the equity that we have seen now in the workforce when it comes to gender. CNN just released yesterday that US employers cut 140,000 jobs in December, according to the latest job reports, and women accounted for all of the losses. 100% of that 140,000 losses were women. And that's because we are the caretakers. We are the ones having to bear the domestic weight of COVID-19, and that Texas is not immune to that. So when women lose our jobs, we can be breadwinners in our family, and that impacts our health, our mental and emotional needs, and it impacts things like the education system. So again, these are all really big concepts. At the root of them start at prioritizing equity as we move through the policy process.
Yeah, I saw that employment stat on Twitter the other day, and I mentioned it to a friend and said that surprised me, and they asked why, and I had to check myself there. So
because you're a man.
Fair, right? Like, I mean, I accept that. So Phil, turning to you, what do you hope that Texans faith will be prioritizing?
Yeah, I'm glad Annaliese said equity. I think it's a great place to start. And I think healthcare, like you said, Medicaid expansion, I think is a really big one. But as I kind of whittled this down, there's like aspirational ones that I really want to focus on. Like I really want to get rid of the death penalty, especially in Texas, but I know that's probably not realistic at this point. And I think that homelessness is going to be a huge issue coming out of all this. But I think what I've really tried to center my focus on is immigration, and just recognizing that we have a lot of work to do here in Texas. And I'm fortunate to have good friends and colleagues, Human Rights Initiative, and Bill Holston is a friend of mine, and was reaching out to him this morning, even asking like, what are the things that are on the docket right now that are just wildly important? And he really said that SB4 is a big issue that's got to be really addressed, as well as expanding the Texas driver's license permit for people without status. And so I think immigration is something that we're going to focus on a whole lot as a church. We have a lot of people who are really fired up about a lot of things, and it's hard to focus on one thing. But I think the immigration, the thing that I love about it on a kind of a theological teaching aspect too, is it's a really great aspect for us, again, who either are white, we're a predominantly white church, but even us here in Dallas, it helps us to not focus on ourselves too. It really helps us to focus outwardly and look at that. And I say that it does benefit us, right? There's a whole lot of economic aspects to immigration within the state of Texas. It really can't be overlooked. So I know it does, there are benefits for us as well, but really that's what we're going to focus on a lot as a church in the year ahead. And I really hope that the Texas legislation can really do some work on that too.
Mohamed, same question.
So I, building on my colleagues' previous two comments here, on a personal level, I'm known as a Republican. So I kind of, I look at the values of equity. The Texas Republican Party actually was founded by more African American members than white members. Yet when you look at where in my political circles with friends outside of the public policy arena, in the partisan politics stuff, I think that part of me kind of forgot it, and my friends have kind of forgot the whole, at least having more equity of opportunity, even if you can't get the whole population to an equitable end result. As a father of three, I have a very serious problem with the unemployment issue you guys were mentioning earlier, because I'm like, okay, I've already had my life. I'm going to be retired in a couple of decades, but every father kind of fears for his daughters afterwards and how they're going to struggle. So I'd love to see that the economy kind of equalize a little bit more. The other issue of immigration, we've been tackling this issue of immigration in the state legislature for at least a decade. So the 2011 session, I recall testifying there and trying to encourage the legislators to hold off on trying to pass something because the federal government was going to try to end up using prosecutorial discretion to not necessarily go after folks who hadn't actually committed any crimes. These are people that are part of our community in Texas. They're also part of a lot of families in Texas, and we should essentially actually just legalize them and, again, increase the opportunities in society. Unfortunately, over the past decade, we've seen that there's a good chunk of our fellow Texans that are kind of thinking more narrowly as opposed to expanding opportunities. So that's a cultural problem that we need to kind of get these fellow Texans to come over and feel generous again, as opposed to thinking in a much more limited fashion. So I support both of those legislative priorities strongly for Texas Impact and our faith community, but I would add another one, which is also kind of near and dear to my heart, is I remember very fondly the days in my old Texas Republican Party, which was, clearly way before 5 or 10 years ago. And one of the fondest memories I have is when I was an election judge. Even though I was appointed as a Republican election judge in my county, in Collin County, which is very red, my colleague, that was from the Democratic side, the deputy election judge, we would always approach the issue of every election cycle as something, it's good to have as many of our fellow neighbors in our precincts actually voting as possible. So enfranchising and getting the will of the voters out there. So I'd love to see in the next legislative session, the state make some progress towards increasing and ensuring transparent elections and as much voter opportunities as possible, as well as security of the ballot. So if you live in an affluent suburban county, and elections in my home county have been, in my opinion, pretty stellar. But if you're in another county that struggles or doesn't have the resources, then I think we as a state should pitch in and make sure that we equalize as much, again, opportunity-wise, statewide, as we can. So that's a third issue that I would add to the two previously covered.
Well, those are certainly three important topics, and we will definitely be talking about election policy, equity. We'll be talking about immigration policy over the course of the next 20 weeks. But I really thank the three of you for joining us today to help preview the legislative session and let our listeners hear from some board members about what you're thinking. So Phil, Mohamed, Annaliese, thank you all so much for the time today. I really appreciate the work you do each and every day.
Yeah, thanks for your leadership, Scott.
Thanks, Scott.
All right. As they exit, we will bring Josh Houston on screen. Josh is certainly a fixture on Weekly Witness, especially during the legislative session. And so there he is. Josh, I miss sitting next to you while we do these Weekly Witness episodes. I don't necessarily miss the drive, but I'll miss seeing you face to face.
Yeah, I miss having an office and the ability to focus uninterrupted.
Yeah, I hope my dogs didn't bark in the background. I was trying to be quick with the mute button. How are you feeling going into session?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not big on talking about feelings. Let's move on to what's going on with that.
All right. It's like it's 2019 all over again. No feelings talk. So, Josh, bring us up to speed. What typically happens in week one of the Texas Legislature? How's COVID going to impact it? And what are we looking at this week?
Yeah, it's going to be a session unlike any other. And I think that is well, everybody is feeling that. If you want to talk about feelings, everybody is feeling the burden of the current situation. And there's a lot we still don't know, and we'll talk about that in a second. But since this is the very first one of the biennium, I suppose you could say, let's start with bill filing. Bill filing has been underway, and it began the first Monday after the election in November. So we're starting to see, we've been tracking it all along, and we're starting to see some trends. Bill filing's way up, which is really interesting because almost everybody agrees that the number of bills they'll be able to pass in a COVID-19 session is going to be way down. Now, that's not over on the Senate side. The Senate is on kind of a normal pace with where they were this time last session in the number of bills that have been filed. The energy's on the House side, where the number of bills is just way up. They are up by about 250 more than they were this time last year. And this time, I guess last biennium, I should say, and this time last biennium, they were only at they were at 500 when I last looked, and they were at 750. But when I did the last research, they're up over 1,000 now, I think is the numbers I tracked last night. I think more interestingly is what are they though? And over 20% of them, at least before the holidays when I kind of ran this data, 20% of them were either a healthcare bill, an election law bill, or a racial justice bill. And the specific breakdown is about 7% healthcare, 7% election law, 6% racial justice of all the bills that have been filed. And this just outpaced every other subject matter area that you could look at. The kind of a distant but significant fourth place was child welfare at 3%. So, about half the number on that category. And then every other category was down below 1%. So it tells you, and what does all this mean? It doesn't necessarily mean that these bills will pass. Filing a bill has, I think, become a lot more like filing a press release. It's evidence to your constituents that you care about a particular issue that they care about. What's more interesting in this data is that it reveals what lawmakers spent the interim, or the quarantine in this case, working on and thinking about. Because in order to have a bill filed this early before session actually gavels in, you would have had to have put your legislative draft request into Legislative Council way back in the summertime. Legislative Council is a body of lawyers that actually drafts the legislation, at least the initial legislation for the legislature. Of course, the members, the legislators themselves are the ones that decide the policy, but that initial draft is done by Legislative Council. And so that's a body that often gets very backed up. And so you'll put your draft request in and not get it back for a couple months. There's a lag time. I go into that detail to say it tells you what that particular legislator thinks is really important and spent their time working on since they last convened 2 years ago. Some of the things we can say about it is that the Republicans and Democrats are pretty far apart, especially on election law issues. You see everything from voting rights bills on the Democratic side to what you could say are pretty voter restriction or voter suppression bills on the Republican side. It's also very clear from some of the healthcare and racial justice bills that I think we know this is true anyway, that people have had extremely different experiences in the pandemic and have come to some very different conclusions about policy direction. And we're going to have to work on that and work that out as a state. Let's move on to the budget a little bit. The biennial revenue estimate, which is the official estimate of how much money the legislature will have to work with, was just released an hour ago. It is always released the day before they gavel in to get the most real-time data on what the budget looks like for the next 2 years. The comptroller of the state has to estimate how much revenue we're going to bring in through taxation, which then tells the legislature how much they have to spend. Final sales tax revenues were way down, about 5% from where we were in 2019. Nevertheless, the news is better than expected. I mean, we're still in a hole, but the hole is not at all what people feared, especially this time. I guess, well, not this time. I guess 6 months ago, everybody was really terrified it was going to be like the 2011 session. So by what amounts, we had expected a nearly $5 billion shortfall in the current budget. So the budget, the 86th legislature, the last one passed, turns out it's just going to be a $1 billion shortfall, which is some good news. The next budget, the legislature is going to have about $112 billion to work with. I was trying and failed while y'all were talking to find the exact number of what it was, but it was in the ballpark of $118 billion in general revenue spending. I might be off by a couple billion on that, but we're at least in the ballpark. So we're looking at a $6 billion shortfall, perhaps in that range. I think, but forgive me, this is literally hour-old news, and I've been on a board meeting and chatting with y'all, so I haven't had time to look at this quite yet. But the top line is that the revenue estimate is not as dire as many feared. A thing about Texas that we can say is that we prefer to do tight budgets and hope for future excesses in revenue, rather than sticking the next legislature with a great big budget hole like some states do. That's just kind of our culture. So that is going to be the way the legislature is thinking about the money they have to work with. The great big wild card that could still make the picture a lot rosier, but it is a wild card we cannot predict, is what does the federal government do? And I think that the election outcome results in Georgia make it more likely that we could see a federal stimulus bill that could bring money to the state, like what happened in 2009 that saved us from a great big budget crisis after the financial collapse in 2008. And then, hopefully we'll be in a better position 2 years from now and not have a repeat of 2011. But that's the great big unknown. I think federal help is a lot more likely than it was this time last week. I guess was that last. It's hard to keep up with time these days.
Yeah.
So let's move on to what we kind of know and don't know about how a COVID-19 session might look. I think this is the stuff that is going to affect y'all and me. That I want to make sure we spend some time talking about. The Capitol is going to be, it was open. The events at the U.S. Capitol closed, the Texas Capitol again. I don't know if it's been reopened or not, but it will be open tomorrow. There is on-site testing available where you can get your COVID-19 test real time before you enter the building. It is highly encouraged but not required. A point of contention, legislators themselves have tried to get clarification on what happens if a person seeking entry, a visitor to the Capitol seeking entry, tests positive. There's not a clear answer to is that person barred from entering the Capitol? That was a thing that I learned on a coalition call that was quite surprising. That said, masks are required in the building if somebody chooses to enter. I will say Texas Impact has zero plans to enter the Capitol, both for the safety of ourselves and for the safety of lawmakers and their staff. Rumor on a coalition call that I heard before Christmas was that 27 staffers have tested positive. That's not really well known and is, again, rumor. But one of the staffers on the call said, yeah, I can believe it because I know 5 of them. So that's a grave concern for the safety of the people in the building. It is going to be up to each office, each legislative office, to set their own policy for their offices. So you're going to see some members just have an open door policy for their offices where people in the building could walk right in. You're going to have some members on the other side decide the complete opposite, where they may not even have their staff or they may have a good portion of their staff working remotely. And then you're going to have everything in between. So each legislative office is going to be different, and that is going to present a set of challenges for those trying to interact with their member. And then the biggest issues, that's what we know, but really the biggest issues we're going to find out on Wednesday, I think, maybe Thursday even. It's just going to depend. So on Tuesday, tomorrow, they're going to come in. They will almost certainly elect a speaker. And they will do a swearing-in ceremony. There are some pretty tight parameters on it compared to the big festive event that it usually is. Nevertheless, it's much more challenging on the House side, where you have 150 members and their families in the House chamber, as large as it is. How it's unclear how many will get packed in there. That's going to be a thing to watch. The biggest issues, though, that I think they're going to have to decide on Wednesday and Thursday is when they go to set the rules, the House rules and the Senate rules for their chambers. And I think the biggest one affecting both policy and the public, which is us, our interaction with that policy, is going to be how they do the rules governing public participation in the committee process. The committee process is where most of the work, heavy policy lifting gets done. That's by design. But also by design, it's because you have a bunch of people in a room working on policy. You have the members on the dais, you have the members of the public, you have all those waiting to testify. We have no idea at this hour how that process is going to work. Is it going to be in person only, which is a huge problem? Is it going to be virtual? Is there going to be some virtual? If there is virtual, will it be open to the public or invited only, which is how they did a lot of the interim hearings, was invited testimony on virtual. That is just a thing we're going to have to watch closely and talk more about in future weekly witnesses about how we're going to go about doing that. The second big question they're going to have to answer is what I'm kind of calling the general workflow. What I mean by that is that usually in a 140-day session, the first 60 days, or roughly a third, a little less, but a little more, but just go with it. The first 60 days is reserved for bill filing. And by our Constitution, state Constitution of Texas says that they will not be passing bills in that first 60 days because they're going to reserve it for the drafting and writing of bills. You usually have the middle third, roughly overlapping thirds of session, heavy on committee. So by the time you get to mid-March, April, you're in committee season. And then by the time you get to late April, May, they're almost entirely on the floor. To some extent, that is somewhat set in stone. But as they kind of negotiate workflow, and by they, I mean the big three, the governor, the lieutenant governor, and the speaker are still negotiating exactly how that's going to work. Do they get started right away? Do they gavel out for the rest of January, which I think is quite possible because you have the inauguration coming up, and many of the Democrats in the state are going to be involved in that national process in some way, shape, or form. Do they gavel out for 30 days and wait for the vaccine to get rolling? That is a real possibility as well, to see how quick they can start getting people vaccinated in the next 30 days, and then revisit the issue, this time in February on the 11th, around Valentine's Day. Who knows? The real wild card, in my estimation of that, is the governor. He does not have to be in the building, and the building meaning the Capitol. He is already vaccinated as well. So how does that play into his political considerations? Usually the governor does a State of the State address where he is present in the House and the whole legislature is in the House chamber. And that is where he might name, and usually names, what are called emergency items. So if every rule has an exception, the general rule that for the first 60 days, the legislature can only file bills, not pass bills. They can do committee hearings too, but no bills are finally passed in the first 60 days. The exception to that rule is if the governor names a certain subject matter to be an emergency item. Now, there's no requirement the legislature get to work on it right away. There's just sort of the political pressure of not taking anything up with haste. And honestly, to be fair, there's a lot of emergencies going on right now. So, are the emergency items something like appropriate more money for the vaccine distribution? Or are they some sort of hot button thing politically? We really just don't know. I'm just naming, I don't have any inside intel that I'm naming, just possibilities that popped in my head about how that could go. So that's a thing to watch as well. And we may not know that this week. We may know that at least the governor's role in the legislative process. We will know that in a couple of weeks, though I think for sure. More unknowns is, how did the events of last week shape their thinking? We have no idea. There are a couple of demonstrations that have been planned at the Capitol that have raised concern in light of what happened at the U.S. Capitol last week. But it is unclear. Well, we know it is. They are taking security precautions for those demonstrations. But as far as workflow is concerned, we're not sure how that's going to affect their thinking. Between COVID-19, the vaccine rollout, and demonstrations turning violent, it would not be surprising if they just decided to let things cool off for 30 days. But we just don't know, and we'll find that out here pretty soon. Let's talk about what we do know. Scott, go ahead.
I was going to say, one of the things we do know, and maybe you were about to say this, we got a question from a participant online. One of the things that will be new this time is we'll have a new speaker in the House. Do you want to say a word about how that process works and what impact presumptive speaker Phelan will have on the body?
Yeah, I mean, the speaker is powerful because the speaker appoints committees and picks picks the chairs of those committees. So with any new speaker, regardless of party, you're almost certainly going to have a new team where those that helped him become speaker are those that he's got the most personal relationship with and are likely to be in positions of leadership going forward. That said, it's a lot like taking a deck of cards and shuffling them. It's an extremely difficult job that will take some time. I think it almost always does, to figure out how many committees do you need? What do you want the jurisdictions of those committees to be? What number of members do you want on each committee? And then what is the construction of those committees? And when you go to construct those committees, you then have to take into account what are called seniority appointments. where I've been in the legislature since, like Speaker Craddock or Dean Craddock, for instance, has been there since 1969. If he says he wants it, he gets it under the rules, presumably, unless they do some major rule change, which we'll find out on Wednesday. And then there are appointments that they ask for that are speaker appointments. And they each provide 3 choices on a card, and the speaker tries to guarantees them usually one of those 3 choices, not always, but for our purposes, one of those 3 is usually what they get. And then they've got to think through, the speaker and the team of people on staff have to think through, how do I, want that constructed? Because those committees are going to stop or rocket legislation to the House floor and have to do the heavy policy work that will shape what that bill looks like. Usually it is rare that a bill is written on the House floor. You would much prefer to be worked on a committee. So it's probably the most important thing Speaker Phelan's going to do is the appointment of committees, and it's going to take some time. So yeah, it is going to be different. It's just the nature of it. The Speaker, of course, gets elected by the 150 members of the Texas House. Now, I want to spend some time on this because I think it is super important. In Washington, D.C., the Speaker is elected by the majority party. In Texas, all 150 members of the Texas House get a vote. And I think this is super important because it forces moderation. It's forced moderation when Democrats had power after Reconstruction to the 21st century. And it is doing the same now with the Republicans in power. And it is what is making the House be a body that is more responsive to the needs of the district than the dictates of a national political party. So I think this is a thing to watch and appreciate about the way we do things in Texas, especially, and we are very biased about this at Texas Impact, especially if you're a person that wants them to do policy and the policy work that affects real Texans, as opposed to the divisive politics that's so driving our national narrative right now. This is super important stuff. I want to get to the nuts and bolts, though, that we at Texas Impact really need to get to, so that we, as the membership at Texas Impact, are effective in the 87th, because it is going to be extremely difficult to be effective, and that's due to the lack of access we're going to have because of COVID-19. It is going to be super hard to get access, and that is not because of anything nefarious, mostly. Every office will be operating differently. We can't work the committees before a committee hearing by just walking the halls like we used to. I can't force a staffer to pick up the phone and talk to me. Staff probably do not have time to talk to me as much as they used to. They may be working from home too, as you may be able to see over my shoulder right now. I can't talk to lobby or staff that I bump into in the Capitol Grill or the hallways of the Capitol. It's amazing how much policy gets passed or not passed because of gossip that happens just in the building. We can't quickly deploy when somebody does a surprise amendment on the floor. I can't just walk into an office, tell them all the same thing at one time, and then they all text their staff or friends. And that's how things get disseminated in a hurry. It's one-to-one, phone, text, Zoom, and it's going to be extremely complicated to be able to stop the surprise amendments. And that's not unique to Texas. That's what we're hearing from our colleagues in other state legislatures and what they're having to deal with. All that is to say, groups that have actual constituents are going to be super, super important. Every group in the state is trying to find 3 to 5 people per legislative district right now to try to help deploy to deal with this communication problem that we're going to have. And I will tell you that I don't just mean the quick phone call and you leave a message. Having an actual authentic relationship with your elected official is going to be at such a premium. Now, I'm very pleased to say we're ahead of the game. Texas Impact, we've been doing rapid response for several sessions now. We've been doing weekly witness with y'all for several sessions now. I think our people are more prone to those authentic relationships with their member than many other groups, which I am very pleased about. I'm very pleased at our membership that historically we're 50% Democrat, 42% Republican, and 8% mixed in our primary voting records of our database of 22,000 people. I think that gives us a leg up in a way that a lot of other organizations don't have. But here's the reason this is such a premium is not partisan at all. People's phone lines are going to be inundated with robocalls. That's normal, and it's going to be doubly true. People's emails get inundated. Their inboxes just get so full from people filling them up. If I was back on staff in the House or the Senate, I would be really worried about this, especially when my eyes and ears are not the person in front of me in the office anymore, but I only have electronics to keep me in touch with the rest of the world. So I would be looking for alternative direct lines just to be able to do my job. Private emails, personal cell phones, and I would be very possessive about who I give that out to, which means we need you to have that kind of relationship where you have direct access, not with 181 members, with your one, to where you can get to a cell phone relationship, as we would say, even if it's just with the staff, that is fine. But to be able to have access and to pass lobby materials electronically and to make sure that those electronic lobby materials get to the right staff person. This is going to be a big team effort where Scott and I are going to be obviously coordinating and relying on you to make our legislative agenda to advance it this next coming session.
Yeah, and so in the weeks to come, once the legislature is in session, we'll end each weekly witness episode with an action alert, which you'll also be able to find on the website and Facebook page. And that'll often be, here's the list of legislation we're going to be watching this week, make some telephone calls. But this week, and spoiler alert, maybe next week, that action alert really is call your office and figure out their policies for this session and who you can best communicate with. Is that right?
Scott, if I may be real specific, find out like, hey, are y'all working from home? Who's working from home? Who's in the office? Man, we're just praying for your health. Make it real positive. Let's not be inhuman about this, or antisocial about it. But who's going to be taking visitors? Who's doing appointments? Who's doing a Zoom only? There's going to be a lot of variation that's going to vary from office to office, and we're keeping up with all that, but only but we also need to hear from you. It really speeds up our work to know how each office is operating in the way that they would prefer to be communicated with, and find out what each staff person is going to be working on, find out who's on staff, find out, which staff people are in the office, which ones are working from home. Just get really specific about the details of how that office is operating, because when we get to the crunch time of committees in mid-March, it's going to be critical information, because I'm not sure that we may be increasing our in-person towards the end of session, but probably not by much. We'll just have to see how quick that vaccine gets rolled out.
So that's the homework assignment for this week, is to make those telephone calls, find out that information. And then the second piece of that is to let us know. We have legislative engagement reports on our website that you can complete, that we encourage you to complete after you make these telephone calls. So we have that information. Or, if you can't find it or are obstinate or something, you can always email me at scott@texasimpact.org and we'll get that in the right place. Josh, anything else you want to hit before we close out today?
Yeah, and feel free to email me too, Josh@texasimpact.org too, because like I said, this is going to be a team effort. Communication is critical. More is more.
Any closing thoughts?
No, I don't think I necessarily. No, I don't have.
All right. Well, friends, thank you all for tuning in. Josh, I look forward to spending the next 20 weeks with you. By the end of the session, we're going to be checking on each other's feelings. Just kidding. I know you don't like that. But I really do appreciate you all tuning in today. We do have some work to do over the course of the next 20 weeks to try to build that Texas that does fit closer to the image of what Texans of faith aspire to. We're going to remember to be positive. We do have some real opportunities to make a difference this session, but it's only going to happen if folks like you are willing to engage in the work this session more than any others for the reasons that Josh has described. Thank you again for tuning in, and remember that this work is supported by members like you. So if you appreciate Texas Impact and the work of the Weekly Witness community, we hope that you will consider becoming a member, either as an individual or as a congregation. You can do that by going to texasimpact.org/join. Friends, we know these are anxious times. We know there are probably going to be news stories over the course of the next few weeks that provide even more anxiety. But now more than ever, the world needs the faith community of Texas active and engaged. So thank you for doing that work. Let's get to work. See you next week, friends.